several years ago, I mean, I began teaching, first of all, in 1974 at the University of Guyana. And I'll sit, because in discussions, that's what one does generally. And I was very fortunate that after 2 years, I had exposure to a group from the University of London called the University of London Teaching Methods Unit, a group that came to Guyana as part of I guess, a British Council mechanism. And they really made a tremendous impact on me. Before that, I had been at a university that did not specifically have evaluations of teaching. So which many of you will go to universities that don't. If you do, one of the first things you can do for yourself is to set up your own evaluation system. Don't say, hey, that's great, I'm at University of X that doesn't have an evaluation system. Do some kind of evaluation system, even if it's only the very simple method of, at the very middle of the quarter, giving people a very simple sheet that says, what am I doing well, and what could be improved. The problem with most evaluation systems, where they do exist, is that you get them, they're done at the end of the course, so you can't change what you're doing. And then secondly, if it's any place like Stanford, you get the results anywhere from 3 months to 6 months after the course is over, by which time you can't even remember what the course was about, really, if you have any kind of decent teaching load. But I had taught at at Johns Hopkins University one semester, I guess, in 1976. And I received some course evaluations that kind of made me a little unsettled. And I'm of the firm opinion that nobody teaches badly because they want to. I mean, none of us does research badly because we want to. And to the extent that we learn how to do research better, we usually go out and try to improve. Most of the time, we have a sense that something is wrong, or evaluations tell us something is wrong, but we really don't know what to do about it. So this wonderful workshop that I had was only a week, taught me a lot of things that I have used throughout my teaching career since then. And to the extent that I teach well, I follow those principles that I learned. One doesn't always follow the things that one learns, so one doesn't always teach well. But to the extent that I do, it's those principles that guide me. Actually, there was a little book called Improving Teaching in Higher Education, which they use as a text. I think it's very hard to get hold of now. And it's one of the things that I'm drawing on for my own presentation today. But let me tell you what I wanted to do first. Let me give you a little outline. First of all, I want to circulate. I expected a small group of about 15 or 20. So I brought some sheets of paper. I'm going to pass some around here, some around there. And when they run out, just use any sheets of paper. And I'm going to ask each of you to just write down on this sheet of paper an answer to either of two questions, or both if you like both. One, what question about discussion leading would you most like to see answered in today's session? Or what's the biggest problem you have ever experienced with discussions or with discussion leading? Okay? So if you can take a few moments to write that down. If you didn't get my standardized sheet of paper, just take your own sheet of paper. And while you're doing that, I'll just tell you what else we'll try to do. The next thing we're going to do after that is have a Buz group discussion, break into some smaller groups and discuss two questions. One, what are the advantages and disadvantages of discussions relative to lecturing and other pedagogical methods? And then B, what are the characteristics of a good discussion? I'm not going to ask you all to discuss both of them. I think I'll ask this side of the room to discuss question A, and I'll ask that side of the room to discuss question B. And then we'll do some general discussion of A and B, drawing on input from both groups. I said here with a recorder, that is somebody to write the points down, but that might be kind of difficult given the logistics of this room and the way we're crowded and everything. And then I'll go on to say a bit more about some specific topics, encouraging interaction, asking questions, the role of the tutor, and then tell you a bit about alternative small group and discussion formats, observing and evaluating discussions, and a summary, all by 1 o'clock. Okay, so what I need first is to have you fill out that card or fill out a piece of paper if you don't have a card telling me either A or B. what question about discussion leading would you most want today's session to answer? And then B, what is the biggest problem you've experienced with discussions or with discussion leading? Okay? So if you could just do that for me, because we don't go much beyond that until you do that. Okay? And once you have done that, if you could somehow funnel those back up to me, I take a look at them over here. And why don't you kind of collect over there and then just give me a stack? And okay, you'll collect over there. Okay, we'll take another minute for that. Okay. Good, thank you. All right, we'll have some more that come dribbling in, but if we just give them to Michelle, she'll get them up to me. Okay, now in the meantime, we have this half of the room, we'll call this A, and this half we'll call B. And I'd like you to form Buz Groups. Now, Buz Groups are the single most important thing I learned in this course, the course I took from the University of London Teaching Methods unit, I guess 20 years ago. And it's groups of two, no more than 3 people who are going to discuss a common topic. So the people on this side should discuss what are the advantages and disadvantages of discussions relative to lecturing and other pedagogical methods, okay, in your group. And then the people on this side should discuss what are the characteristics of a really good discussion, okay? So when I say go, I will hear this buzz of wonderful discussion. Right? And turn and face each other and so on, you know. Introduce yourselves. Okay. Let's try to get back and discuss this topic. I brought along some papers to make tense. That is, one can either use name tags or tense to identify yourself. And tense are, of course, these nice little triangular objects that one makes. And you then try to just set it up. I've also brought along some Scotch tape. We can use these to put in front of you. Of course, difficulty is a lot of people are sitting outside rather than inside. Nevertheless, let's try it in some way. So name tags would have been better for this group. Let me pass around some tense, and I can pass around some Scotch tape on both sides. So if you can write your name, and then here's some pens on this side, and I have at least one pen over here. If you can just write your names, then that would help, fairly big and broad, okay? And set that up in front or somewhere nearby. And let's hear from the people who looked first at the A question. By the way, there's space all behind here. There's space over here. So come on in if you wish, please. What about the advantages and disadvantages of discussions? And what I'd like is for the groups, the little Buz groups, to just give an idea of the kinds of points that came up in your group. They may not be your opinion. They may just be things that somebody else said within your group. But please go ahead now and give us some ideas of what kinds of advantages came up in your groups. Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's see. You can get more people to talk, because then it's more interesting for the rest of them.
Okay. Yes?
In our group, discussing the main advantage of the lecture is efficiency in covering materials. The main advantage of discussion is just the level of involvement. So that's very basic.
Okay. Efficiency versus involvement. Okay.
Lectures are efficient if the people are motivated to learn it and understand the importance of what's being said. If they're not, then efficiency doesn't.
Okay, it's a question of motivation, and which one actually then affects motivation more, lecturing or discussion leading. There's also an interesting question relating to that having to do with retention. How much is retained in either method? I don't know if that came up in any other groups. Yes?
And there's a chance for students to test their own ideas in a small environment.
Okay.
Get feedback on that.
Right. Chance for somebody to test their own ideas. What else came up? What came up over here?
Pretty long list.
Go ahead.
The engagement of students, which is something before.
Engagement, yeah.
The topic came up of teaching is learning twice. That when one has the opportunity to teach to others, certainly personalizes the information.
You mean as a member of the discussion group, when you pass that information on to others, then it personalizes and maybe reinforces but your ideas, okay?
And it gives the lecturer the opportunity to get some feedback on how they feel what's understood in this.
Right, okay.
One of the concerns we had was often in a discussion group is that students clam up. And one of the solutions to that is what we just did here.
Right.
Break into small groups,
Right.
so people are armed when you come back together
Right.
with ideas to group, small groups.
Right, right. Yes, now of course we should be doing a recorder, but as I said, because of the way this room is set up and everything, we don't have, we're not going to do that. So we hope you're making notes. And by the way, that's one of the things I didn't put down in any of my handouts. But you have to remind people to make notes during discussions, because a lot of people, they just kind of sit back. It's like films, and you bring a film into your class, and everybody just kind of cocks back and so on, and they don't ever make any notes. So you need to kind of create an atmosphere in which you encourage people to make notes on discussions and points that are raised in discussions. It's very hard after you've gone even 5 minutes in a discussion to remember all the issues that came up, especially in the ways that people frame them. So you really want to encourage your participants to make notes as they came up. A little point came up there that I think we don't always remember, which is that when you are in a discussion and you're getting this kind of constant feedback from the audience, you're getting a chance to see how people are learning, which is something that often as teachers we tend not to remember. You would think that we're as much concerned about learning, or ultimately learning is our big business. But we usually tend to focus on our own selves and our own little performance. So I have my lecture beautifully written, and I have my handouts, and I have my overheads and so on. And ultimately the issue is not about us. The issue is about what our learners are getting out of what we are doing with them in the course. And discussion gives you an opportunity to get that kind of feedback all the time, not just on midterms and exams and so on and so forth. Is there any group that didn't get a chance to speak? Let me just sample somewhere behind there. Yes?
One problem that comes up often in discussion groups that come with lectures is that people feel sort of reluctant to show whether they've done their reading assignments. They feel anxious about speaking up because they feel like they might embarrass themselves with saying something. Shows they haven't done enough work. So I find that's often a thing that's really hard to overcome, that people are simply afraid to show what they've done.
What kinds of solutions do we have to that problem? Some people mention that in these lists. problems of people being reticent to show knowledge or lack of knowledge. There's a related problem that some people mention, how to get depth at the same time that you get involvement, because people sometimes feel that people may come not having done the readings and so on. Any ideas? Yes?
Breaking a larger group up into smaller groups makes shy people feel more comfortable about contributing.
Okay, so doing some version of Buz Groups to begin with is helpful, especially if in the Buz Groups the understanding is that you are not personally responsible for the points that you make. So that if you have a Buz Group of 3 or 4 people, you're talking about issues that came up in your group without necessarily claiming ownership. Okay. The other thing that one can do, and I'm kind of accelerating here so we can, I'd like to discuss all of these issues, but to kind of help us get through, sometimes one can link a discussion to a prior assignment, especially a prior written assignment. So if you ask people, for instance, to do this, you use this technique in which you ask people to write some notes, or write a squib, write a reaction to a particular assigned reading, and to bring it for submission on that particular day. By and large, students will then have done the reading, and they'll come somewhat better prepared. And in fact, the thing that you ask them to write about may be the same kind of thing you ask them to discuss. So at that point, they tend to come with a little more background than when the syllabus just says, read pages 10 to 20 or 10 to 100, and you're then expecting them to have done that when they come in. Yes?
Yeah, excuse me, I used that before, and it works really well when you're focusing on, say, one article for your discussion section. Right. What I found, though, is that usually, I mean, especially with the quarter system, you're assigning multiple articles to be discussed in a weekly section, and then I would assign, just as you're suggesting, maybe 4 or 5 discussion questions, one of which was actually to be turned in a written form. And when we discussed that question, we had incredible discussion. Right. But since the other ones were not turned in, they didn't even look at the other questions.
Right. Any solutions to that? Any ideas about that?
Turn them all in, but you don't have to read all the answers.
I missed the last part of what you said.
Just because students turn in every question doesn't mean you have to read all the answers.
Right, no. But I think it's not just a question of reading. You're saying that...
Well, it'd be a lot of work to ask the students to prepare like 5 written 2-page things.
Right.
It's not
well,
possible.
There's a solution to that, yes.
A couple of thoughts. One is you could divide the group and have different parts of the class assigned to each question.
That's right.
The other thing you can do is have them hand in one and let it be known over time that you're always asking them to discuss a different one. Right. Instead of keeping them uncertain.
Right. Or you could do a variation. Those are both good suggestions. You could do a variation of the things some people do for exams, where they say, the exam will be on one of these 5 questions. And people then really do go off and try to prepare them all. That's a challenge, a very particular kind of challenge that's different from many regular discussions where you don't necessarily require knowledge. Sometimes it's good to, in fact, frame your discussions in ways that don't necessarily require knowledge of the reading. For instance, as a resident fellow, we often assign freshmen a book to read over the summer. And of course, they're the conscientious ones who come back with every page with highlighter and so on and so forth. But then there are the others who clearly just picked it up in the bookstore the morning of the discussion or something. And so we try to include questions that may relate to the larger issues that are raised in the book, but don't necessarily require a knowledge of every single point that's raised on every page. Now, you still want to include in the discussion some topics that allow the people who have done the deeper kind of reading to kind of display that and to raise the issues displayed there. But at that point, the other people can kind of just try to look interested or something, and you can have a bit different parts of the discussion for different people. Of course, I think a lot of times we tend to be afraid of free reign. It's partly because it usurps our role, or because, and this is the point I'm going to make a little later, but I may as well make it now, you don't want to be accused of not teaching. As a teacher, I'm the one in charge. I know the stuff. Knowledge flows downhill or whatever. I guess you're afraid that if you do too much of this stuff, people may say, well, does he really know anything? He just kind of sits there and nods and recognizes different people. And it takes a lot of confidence to not be afraid of that. One of the things that's often amazed me when you have a very good discussion going is how, when it goes very well, people can end up coming up with many of the points that you wanted to make. I mean, you could almost have your own little checklist and scratch off many of them. And then at the end, it may only be 2 or 3 other points that you have to make. In fact, this is partly what I'm doing here with this technique. I mean, I could have just dealt with the first part of this presentation by saying, you know, pluses and minuses of discussions using, you know, my own experience and the books I have and so on. But I think a lot of the points that I would want to make and a lot of points that the books make have already been made in one form or another by people in the group. And when they arise out of this kind of group participation and group discussion, they tend to be, you know, much more deeply felt, much more strongly believed, much more clearly understood than just presenting a very long lecture. Please come in, by the way. There's really a space all up behind here, and I feel bad to see people kind of standing up outside. Any other disadvantages?
Along that line, we were talking about how to effectively deal with digression.
Digressions, right. How do you deal with digressions? Anybody? You needn't have been an A group, you know. You guys all have some expertise. How do you deal with digressions? Anybody? Yes?
Bounce the response, the digressive response off another student and see if that other student will help guide that. Sometimes it works,
okay.
Sometimes it doesn't.
Kind of a reflector approach.
Draws the other students in who
Yes.
don't want to digress as much.
Right. Okay. Any other suggestions?
I think that at some point you just have to crack the whip and make sure that the discussion is structured and people stick to the text. I mean, you have to take a Stalinist approach at some point.
Okay. Right, so she's saying we have to crack the whip. Of course, you don't necessarily take a Stalinist approach, right? I mean, typically what lecturers do, what's the favorite phrase that we use? That's very interesting. That's a very interesting point, Jim. But can we get back to the other issue that we were dealing with? Yeah. Yes.
You can actually say that without, if you leave the but out, it probably has a different tone to it. So if you say, for instance, that's a very interesting point. And then just go back to the other thing without the little words like but, like that can kind of target to the person that they've been sort of, put off in some way.
Put off or put down. Yes, you're right. Sometimes, of course, it really is interesting. It's just not today's topic. You could say, so we really will talk about this next week, and keep those thoughts and do bring them again next week, and so on and so forth. Let's just turn over here and see what people consider characteristics of a good discussion. So, any group.
People talking, not just a TA or a few students.
Okay, many people talking, right? That probably is the thing that came up most often on these sheets, or at least the converse. Nobody talks. And I say, let's discuss this, and nobody talks. Okay? Mm-hmm. Anything else? Yes.
Raising the topic in using as examples items that are relevant to the people in the group. So phrasing your topic with their experience.
Okay. So that's at least the beginning, at the beginning phase. Presumably, what we would mean is that as the discussion proceeds, your topics or your concerns do get maybe addressed, but from their perspectives, right? And I think a lot of times we have to be prepared for it coming out somewhat differently than how we, initiated it, because that's precisely the point, that you have ideas and knowledge being filtered through many different minds. That's the whole value of discussion, or one of the values of discussion. Okay, what else? What else makes a good discussion? Yeah.
Whether or not it sticks to the agenda you had at the end, being able to summarize the main points of the discussion, letting the students leave the discussion with some main points in their head, so they don't feel like it just ended without some kind of closure. Okay.
Good summary.
Yeah, not just having people present their own ideas, but responding to one another's ideas. Sort of hinging in on what other people have already said.
Listening, right. Yes.
That's what our group was saying, that it isn't just that everyone should talk, but that they should talk to each other and listen to what people are saying.
Yes.
Important that people in discussion simply don't agree with one another out of a reticence to speak their mind, that there be some honest give and take and difference of opinion.
Okay, so honesty. Yes.
Okay.
We felt that the most important thing that sort of runs through a lot of things that have been said is that you have a comfortable environment where everybody feels free to participate, where nobody is sort of being consistently left out or is hesitating to talk.
I'm just adding to those 2 points. We're creating an atmosphere where people feel safe to express their honest opinion, so that they know that they can share those things without being attacked.
Yes. Again, related to what the other group said too, there's a Lao Tzu quote that says, effective leaders are those who, when it's done, the people feel like they did it themselves, and might mean that your evaluations say things like, you were lazy and that you didn't know what you were doing. But that still might be the most important.
I have never said that. Anybody who does discussions, and lots of discussions in their class, there's that quote you were talking about, of a good leader when his task, and I've tried to keep saying his, her, and so on. These things were written a while ago, or was said a while ago. Of a good leader when his task is finished, his goal achieved, they say, we did this ourselves. Okay, so that's in fact relates very nicely to the role of the discussion leader. A lot of good points came up here so far. Some of them we're going to try to cover as we go through. I'm going to try to move a little more quickly, and at this point I am going to give out my handout, since I no longer am in danger of influencing the discussion in a negative way. Just take a look at those quotations that I have on the first page, because I think they get at a lot of the deeper values and deeper experiences that people tend to have more with discussion than they tend to have with lecturing, and is one of the motivations for really trying to perfect your art of discussion leading. The fact that it very often seems to produce more imaginative thinking. It tends to produce more excitement, more interest. Tends to make people sit up and be more highly motivated than other kinds of teaching. And you have at the end from Rogers, 1969. I've come to feel that the only learning which significantly influences behavior is self-discovered, self-appropriated learning. I'm going to go very quickly now to some points, some suggestions that I can make drawn on my own experience and drawn also from the references which you have at the end of this handout that deal with some of the problems that people commonly encounter in discussion leading, and in fact are some of the things that came up in these sheets that you provided for me. I'm going to put some of these things up here on the overhead, primarily for the benefit of people who might be watching the broadcast later on and not have access to our handout. So probably the first most important thing for encouraging interaction is to get the right kind of room. It can be very hard. It's very hard at Stanford. We have many rooms that are set up for lectures with nice fixed chair seating. Much harder to find a room like this. Okay, much harder to find a room that has movable seats so that you can kind of create a circle. Avoid doing what we're doing here today, that is sitting or standing at the head of the table, right? I mean, because of the equipment, because of the way this is set up, somebody who comes in a sense, knows right away that I am leading this discussion, right? And it's also one of the reasons why the kind of discussion we've had so far, all your questions and feedback have been coming to me, right? It's partly because of the size of the group. It's hard to do a discussion with 50 people. But ideally, you should consistently resist, the head chair at the table and sit somewhere in the middle and, in a sense, just be another Joe or Jane as a way of facilitating discussion. Use things like these name tags or, little tents so that people know who they're talking to. I mean, Fred and Marianne and Ronaldo and so on, rather than just, the guy with the blue tie or and so on and so forth. Now, point D has to do with what you do while people are speaking. And there are somewhat different opinions. Some people say, of course, it's very important to show this kind of engaged interest in the one person. and you want to do a measure of that. But that can be really intimidating for some people too. You know, everybody's attention is focused on you. So sometimes what people suggest is, in fact, you know, you look at the person, but you also glance around the group so that the person feels a little less pressure on them, and so that you're sensitive to what other people may be trying to say or wanting to say. That's the only way you can kind of pick up feedback from the group about who wants to go next. Use the method that I've tried to use to some extent today, the Socratic Method. It's very easy when people ask questions to say, you know, here's the answer, all right? It really takes discipline to say, but what do you think? And of course, maybe the first few times you try it, they kind of laugh at you. But it really becomes a habit to try and get them to figure things out for themselves. Now, obviously, you'll come in to kind of add some information to modify an answer, but you really want to encourage them to think things through for themselves. Okay? The more you do that, the more involved they are. You look at any class that has good discussion and people are awake, especially in these evening sections, which are so popular at Stanford. People come after a meal and so on. If you just talk at them for an hour, chances are they'll start to nod and doze off in the corners. If they get a chance to talk and be involved, it's very hard to sleep and talk at the same time. Okay. F, avoid the temptation to reject or correct a student's contribution, right, which can be often very inhibiting. You might invite him or her to elaborate or to reconsider. Is that really so? Ask for others' opinions. What do you think, Dagfin? Or what does anyone else think about that? Now, sometimes there are things that are just flat out wrong, and you may want to correct them. Actually, discussion leading is a very complex skill because you're actually doing many things at once. You may not want to respond right away and say, you know, what Joe said, you know, is just ridiculous. It's just totally flat out wrong. You may want to say, well, okay, let's think about that for a moment, take another point, but you have it at the back of your mind that you want to get back to this point. So at some stage later in the discussion, hopefully not too far along, you'll say, well, actually, the way people actually went about this problem is this and this and this and this. So you can kind of correct this without necessarily saying, you know, that awful student in the corner over there is the one who said that this obtained and this is definitely wrong. G is, you know, avoid stating your own opinion too rigidly, although one can sometimes make a strong or outrageous statement in order to stimulate good argument. A lot depends on what you're trying to do and what kinds of discussion you're trying to mediate. You know, if you have a general discussion in the dorms about, you know, 3 strikes or about capital punishment or Prop 209, you may want, in fact, to kind of hold back on some of your opinions a lot. For some academic issues, it may, in fact, be good to take a very strong position on one side and deliberately invite people to take an opposing kind of position. Timeout when appropriate. Depends how long the discussion is. Calling timeout when appropriate. I think my batteries are dying, fast dying on me here. So this, oh, here it is. Timeout when appropriate to review progress or process or to change direction. So this is very helpful in cases where people feel you start to go off course a bit, right? Or if things have gotten too hostile, or if things are too placid, okay? You might say, as someone said, you know, well, what do you really think? Because, you know, this discussion is just going along too nicely. I'm not getting any kind of heart and guts in this discussion. Finally, again, for the benefit of those who are looking on TV, give dominant students alternative roles like note-taker. Okay, Frank, you've been doing such a good job. If you could make some notes on the points that are taken that we're discussing, that may help. And of course, looking at and recognizing others. You have to be careful of that because sometimes Frank is very dominant, but next to him is, you know, Bill, who may be very quiet. And if you just avoid looking at that part of the room, you may leave out Bill altogether. And then notice reticent students seek out their opinions. The next point I make here about going around the room is one that people have different opinions on. People sometimes say, well, you know, it really puts people on the spot. If I say, well, at this point in the discussion, I'd like to go around this room and I'd like to ask everybody just to say make one comment on this reading or this issue. Okay. I guess I have found more in my experience that I'm amazed that this person who really had said nothing up to this point had, in fact, a well-formulated, insightful point to make. So I would prefer to err on the side of, you know, maybe putting them a bit on the spot, but to some extent, I mean, that's what education is about. I mean, asking people to refine their ideas, to state their ideas, to change their ideas. So I'd prefer to say that with the understanding that you're not going to belabor it, so that if, you know, if Fred doesn't want to speak very long, or he just makes a little point, we just say thanks and we move on. You know. Okay, let's turn now quickly to asking questions. And again, I have a number of points there. The first is, of course, to have a good idea beforehand of the objectives of the discussion. I mean, this really means so much. I mean, and the other thing that I learned from the University Teaching Methods unit is the importance of, at the beginning of every course, asking yourself, what are my objectives? Right? Most of us really never take the time to do that. And in fact, in a really good course, those objectives are spelled out somewhere in the course, not only in terms of abstract things like learning to see alternative points of view, but being able to do A, B, C, and D. Okay? Obviously, if you really wanted to get some critical concept here, then that's going to be a somewhat different objective from getting them to think through different sides of an issue. So your lead-off questions are often very important. You may take you know, interesting quotations from the readings that people are doing, or you may, in fact, invite people to come with questions. So some variation of the kind of technique that we did here. Avoid fishing expedition questions. You all know what those are. I got into it in one or two of my questions earlier, where you know exactly what you want to hear, and they're all just trying to guess it, and it's very frustrating for both parties. You may as well tell them what you want to tell them, and or just ask about other things that are more interesting. Obviously, ask WH questions, why, what, how, rather than simple yes/no questions. Ask questions that, point D, that elicit responses at the higher ends of Bloom's taxonomy. You know, the conceptual ends, the end that has to do with comparing, with evaluating, rather than saying what's right and what's wrong. Point E, very hard for TAs, very hard for professors. Once you've asked a question, don't be afraid to wait for an answer. Okay? I know it gets awkward, but if you always fill the silences, you will never get an answer. Okay, well, you know, John Rickford has about 3.3 seconds, and then he's going to chip in. Okay? If it gets too oppressive, go back to Buz Groups. I mean, the nice thing about Buz Groups is that when you say discuss, there is buzzing. Okay? Now, you hope most of the time that they're in fact talking about the issue that you asked them to talk about and not about the big game or something else. But it tends to work, and it tends to loosen people up. And then finally, read and give nonverbal cues. You can often ask a question with a glance. Okay? Or, again, looking around the room, it's very important for you to be able to read the cues that people are giving off. You know, when they're getting bored, when they're getting excited, when it looks as though they may have something to say, but they're never really getting a chance to say it. Okay, now the role of the tutor, which we've already said something about. I just lost my overhead. I'm not sure where that one went. But the role of the tutor, I've said it here fairly simply. The biggest obstacle is the fear that you will not be seen as an authority, that people are going to write on your evaluations. You know, he had many discussions, but he never taught us anything. If you are doing discussion leading well, okay, then, in fact, a lot of the key issues will come up, and people will be far more stimulated and excited. Very often when I say in my kind of midterm evaluations what's going well, people say discussions. I like when you break us up and let us interact. Okay. Now, let me quickly just go through some alternative small group and discussion formats. And let me see if I can get to that very quickly. Put these up here. The Buz Groups, the things we've exemplified and talked about, to me are the bread and butter of good discussions. Secondly, there's a slightly more complicated thing, which I think I tried once, but my math didn't work out right, and it got kind of confused. But it's an interesting technique where you have these square root groups, where you divide the class into the square root, the number of groups corresponding to the square root of the number of people in the class. So 4 groups if there's 16 people, 3 groups if there are 9. And after 10 minutes or so, you let one person from each group shift to another group. Right? This is very good at helping people to get to know each other initially in a class, and also in getting them to see different points of view. Okay, so there's a little kind of readjustment when the people who were in the group kind of brief the newcomers as to what they've been talking about, and the newcomer briefs the person as to what's been going on. Okay. Other things, of course, control class discussion is, of course, what most of us do, and most of the time it's not very well done. And this is more like what we've been doing here today, where you have somebody who is really controlling the discussion. That can be very productive in some ways, but a lot of times it has a very kind of shriveling effect. Seminars, of course, you know what those are. Syndicates, which is kind of more of a British notion. We don't really have that here. But a situation in which you have a group that works both within and outside the class on a topic, maybe for half of the course or maybe for the entire course. And sometimes they'll discuss within the group, and sometimes they wouldn't. Brainstorming, I think, is a technique that many of you already know about, and one that's pretty well favored. Every time I pick up my things, I lose something else at the back of it. Debates. Okay, debates can be very useful. Together with role play, let me just say some of the ways in which I've used this. Sometimes we'll have a discussion on an issue. For instance, in my sociolinguistics class, the wisdom of the English-only initiative. You know, should everybody be required to speak English? Should we only have ballots and official documents in English? And I'll ask people what their opinions are on the topic. And once I know what those are, I'll then ask them to debate the opposing side. So you deliberately force them to kind of cast aside their preconceived notions and to argue for the other side. And they often kind of laugh at themselves as they say it, and then you can see them as the time goes on really getting into it and being as virulently for the other position as they were for their position in the beginning. Not that they necessarily end up really believing the other position, but I think you have this very useful experience of trying on a very different perspective. Role plays are like that. Finally, a technique that's very well set, this room is actually nicely set up for right now, is the Fishbowl Technique, in which you have half of the class in the middle like this, discussing an issue, and the other class outside observing, taking notes. And those observations and notes could either be about the kinds of topics, the kinds of content of the discussion, or they could be about the form. For instance, in my sociolinguistics class, I've used this very effectively to look at the way men versus women interact. Look at who interrupts. Look at who speaks more, and so on. So here you have this little group in the middle merrily doing their little discussion, and you have a group outside, and you slip them a sheet of paper each that tells them what to do, but the people inside don't know what they're doing. Okay, it can be a very kind of rich and fruitful technique. Okay, I think that covers most of what I wanted to say. It's helpful to have some means of evaluating discussions, right? We often do, and observing them and looking at them. If some of you may be mentor TAs, or you may be professors who take the time to go around to your student sections and actually see what they're doing and to help them. Or you may invite them to look at you. And this little checklist at the back is useful for helping you to discuss how well the discussion went afterwards. Okay? And I think I'm going to stop there and not try to do any summary. In a sense, the outline as you have it provides a summary of the main points. Probably the only additional summary I would say is that for many of us, discussions really provide a means to get people more engaged with the material, to get people more excited with the material than straight lectures. There is some evidence that people tend to retain what they learn in discussions more than they do in lectures. And so therefore, the real challenge is how to do them effectively. And I hope that some of what we've presented today will help you to be better able to kind of encourage interaction, ask the right kinds of questions, take the kind of role that frees people up to participate more fully and to learn more from the process of discussing. Well, there are a couple of books in here that I would refer you to. One is the one by Bly et al., 7 Decisions When Teaching Students. The Sawyer 1943, I haven't actually read, but there's just these wonderful quotations that come from it. Mathematician's Delight. The Ramsden is also a recent book. I think it's an Australian, where he tries to address the issues of how a lot of this applies to the sciences as well as the humanities and social sciences and the natural sciences and the technical subjects like engineering. Not having worked in those fields myself, I don't have as much experience with that. But just from the discussion, I think the things that they try to get people to do are to go beyond the nuts and bolts, you know, how you do a particular, how you build a particular kind of object, for instance, to asking, you know, why you build it in a particular way? What happens if you built it in another way? And so on and so forth. So again, even in subjects that involve fairly cut and dry material that involves knowledge, the object always is to try to get people to ask the why questions, the how questions, the what if questions. Because ultimately those are the most important questions. If you think of the people who become the top engineers, the people who become the top leaders in science and engineering, it's people who are conceptualizing things in a somewhat different way rather than necessarily the person who knows everything about how to do a particular experiment. But the mechanics of how you actually do it will obviously take a little more experience and expertise than I have. But some of the people in here are very conscious of that issue and have tried to address it. I think usually I use this technique that I mentioned today of making the person a note taker is one that I just read about when I was preparing for this. I've never actually tried that. I think it'll work to some extent. But I think sometimes I've done some variation of what probably most of you do is, thanking them or saying, well, let's hear from Frank over here. And so, trying to kind of shift my attention. But I'm always conscious of this potential danger that there's a cluster of people around the one person who you're avoiding. And so you want to be able to recognize them too. The other thing with it is that the other danger with it is that, I mean, what I'm saying is the ideal discussion is one that we really haven't gotten to here today, because discussions, people are talking to each other rather than to you. And if you have to use techniques to, get Bob out of the way, then you are, again, assuming this role of the real leader in the group. Curiously enough, I think you actually get less of a problem the more the group really gets discussing, because part of what Bob is doing is trying to score points with you yourself. So when you're really talking to each other, you get more. And then people they'll be blunter than you are. They'll say, don't cut me, and that kind of stuff that you may not say yourself. So I think that you can depend on the dynamics of the group.
We'll have to make this the last question.
Oh, there's probably somebody waiting to come in here.
Another technique I've used in this situation is to, if this is happening in a large class discussion, is to break into smaller groups and say, okay, one person is the person who's doing most of the talking will not, when we come back together, not report. You, the other person in the group, must report what person A. Person B must report what person A said.
Right.
And when person B reports, not only do they say what A said, but they usually add what they have to say.
Very good, very good, very good. It works the other way too. I really think that when you're a recorder, that you tend to and listen, because you're responsible for writing down what people have said. Yes.
John,
okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.